participation, and participation being at the core of accountability to children. So that's why I said we couldn't have had like a better group of presenters with us here today. And with no further delay, I would like to leave the floor to Kate Mahoney. And if you want to read more about our lovely presenters' background, Julie will be sharing a bio doc, like with their briefs in the chat. Over to you, Kate, and welcome to all again.
Thank you so much, Elena, and everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here today. So welcome to our session with us and for us. And we would like to take a little bit of your time to share with you the IASC guidelines on working with and for young people in humanitarian action. I'm Kate Mahoney, and I am a consultant, and I work on child protection, young people's engagement, and refugee protection. And I'm currently working with the Women's Refugee Commission to support the Global Refugee Youth Network, and with UNICEF on Adolescent and Development Team to support the rollout of these guidelines. So the purpose of this session is really to provide an overview of what the IASC guidelines on working with and for young people in humanitarian and protracted crisis, that's a long title, normally we just use the youth guidelines, what it is, and how they can be used to guide and advance prevention of child protection concerns. And two, really to spur discussion on what could and should be, what could and should the Alliance do as part of this rollout of its strategy for accountability in terms of the accountability priority. So really the aim of these guidelines is to serve as the go-to guide for working with and for young people in humanitarian settings. And when we say young people, we're looking at the age range of 10 to 24. So, I mean, first, the subgroup of adolescents under 18 are obviously children themselves. And as adolescents, they are going through a period of huge change and are particularly vulnerable to specific child protection concerns, such as child marriage, gender-based violence, association with armed groups and armed forces, child enforced labor, and detention. And these guidelines can really help us be more attuned to their needs at this age and stage of their development, and to work more effectively with and for them. And second, older adolescents and youth are just an amazing resource that's overall underutilized. Young people can do amazing child protection work, and the guidelines can help us understand better what they can do, how we can work with them, and how we can better recognize and appreciate the work that they're doing and partner with them more effectively. So we want you to go away understanding that there is this huge and great resource out there, and to start thinking about how you might be able to use it and how the Alliance strategy could support you to use it more effectively. Next slide, please, Julie. So I'd like to, we have a couple of young people who are our keynote speakers, and I'd like to just briefly introduce them. First, we have Farida Luanda, who is a young refugee woman, 23 years old, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, who founded the Vision Group, a refugee youth-led organization, or a RYLO, or one of our newest acronyms, that focuses on empowering and protecting young people. Farida is also a founding member of the Global Refugee Youth Network, or GRIN. Farida, please tell us a bit more about yourself and your motivation to work in child protection.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and good evening. I am Farida Randa from Democratic Republic of Congo. I lived for 5 years in Chakatu refugee settlement in Uganda, and this year I moved to Stockholm, Sweden. When I was a child, like other children, I had dreams for my future. I wanted to grow up to be a lawyer. Due to conflict, I lost my mother at the age of 8 years old, and all my dreams washed away. I was separated from my brother, and I was set to live with my uncle's family. There, I endured sexual abuse. I was forced to marry at the age of 13, and I was pregnant and delivered my son at the age of 15 years. With a lot of complication, I was always scared. Many times I was not sleeping at night. When I was 17 years old, I became a widow. When the father of my son was also killed due to the conflicts, I fled to Uganda, Chakatu refugee settlement. There, I found my brother, and I started my work with the Vision Group, a refugee-led organization that transforms young people's lives through music, dance, drama, education, and livelihood activities, especially girls and young women. We have been through struggles and we have had limited opportunities. We have experienced child protection challenges and we don't want to see it repeated in our new communities. We are trying to make a change for us, in refugee youth. The desire to protect children comes from our own individual lived experiences. We have turned our vulnerabilities into strength, and that gives us unique expertise that is driving our work. Young people who have been through this experience can play a big role in preventing and reducing violence against children. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Farida. That helps us understand why and young people should be involved and what they have to contribute. Now I'd like to turn to Leo. Leo Christian Lauzon is a young humanitarian and development worker in the Philippines who is the founding president of Kabataan San Sidlangan. I may not have pronounced that right. A youth organization focused on youth empowerment and a member of YPeer Philippines, which is the largest youth organization working on adolescent sexual reproductive health in emergencies. And he's been very active in several of the recent disasters that the Philippines has endured. Leo, the floor is yours. We'd like to hear more from you about you and your work.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Mabuhay. I am Leo Lauzon from the Philippines. I am a humanitarian worker, gender development practitioner, and a young leader from Eastern Visayas. So at first hand, I was a Typhoon Haiyan survivor back in 2013, and that motivated me to become a humanitarian worker myself, working on some of the huge humanitarian and disaster responses here in the Philippines. And that was an eye-opener for me on the plight of children and young people during disasters. And working with women and young people and children, it helped me understand how as a young person and children are in the best position to help one another. Because, for example, for young people, they assume many roles in the lives of children. They belong to the same generation. They are either sibling, friend, playmate, and even a mentor and a protector. So it's very much important that we provide platforms for children and young people to have opportunities to develop their skills and leadership. That's why we organized Kabataan San Siglangan, or the Youth of Eastern Visayas, because we believe that by when we empower children and young people, they can actively engage child protection actors to demand space and platforms for meaningful participation in the decision-making and policy-making processes, as well as influence crucial outcomes in terms of governance and program implementation in the community and in the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leo. And I, what I hear is so many common threads between what you're saying and what Farida is saying. It's, that experience yourself is really driving you, but it's also really an expertise that you bring. So thank you. With that, we'd like to move into a video. I know that can be some technical challenges with the video, but if you can help us with that, Julie, that would be great. This is a brief video that helps us to understand just, how what was the impetus for the IASC guidelines and how they were developed. It's very brief, about 2.5 minutes. Thanks, everybody. That's kind of a fun video that just gives us a quick snapshot of the guidelines. And now I'd like to dive in and just introduce two other members of our team in a little bit more depth, and then hand over the floor. So first, Erica Yage is a young humanitarian worker currently working with UNICEF headquarters, and I have the pleasure to work closely with her. She's part of the Adolescent Participation and Development team. She's particularly focused on youth participation in humanitarian and peace building, and she has been really instrumental in finalizing publication of these guidelines and putting together an amazing hybrid training package that can be used in person or virtually to help us roll them out. So that's a resource which is going to be coming online shortly. And Josh Chapin is an independent consultant and educator who works towards positive change for girls and women, adolescents and youth in humanitarian settings. He was one of the people who actually originally conceived of these guidelines and was the lead drafter before handing it off to the team that finalized everything. So we're really lucky to have you here, Josh, as somebody who can help us understand where this started and what process it went through and what it is and what's its initial intent. So with that, I'd like to, if we can get the slides up again, I'd like to turn the floor over to Josh, who's going to walk us through the guidelines in a little bit more depth. Help us understand what they are, and hopefully contribute to, I see an interesting chat that's unfolding in the chat section on, how participation fits in and what are the other aspects of accountability. So Josh, the floor is yours, and we should have the slides up shortly.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. Really happy to see all of you. Would be even happier to see the slides if they can come up soon.
Sorry, Josh. Sorry, apologies. We went a little out of order, so I just want to make sure I've got the right slides for you. Bear with me, because I just
No worries.
Same deck, just further along.
Yep. So bear with me. All right, I'm just going to share my screen, and maybe you just tell me to flip if I'm not on the right one.
Okay.
That's okay. Is it this one?
Next
one.
Come on.
Tech issues are the new normal.
This one?
Keep going. One more.
That one?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry about that.
How did we get to these guidelines? The guidelines come out of what's called the Compact for Young People in Humanitarian Action, which came about after years of advocacy with UN agencies and NGOs. The main message being that young people were kind of falling between the cracks in emergency response. So this was the group of principal agencies that came together to make some major commitments to getting better outcomes for young people who are living in emergencies, including the commitment to create some guidelines. This is a visual just to kind of show the various agencies that contributed to the guidelines. And I mean, you can just tell by the slide that it was an incredible achievement for the organizers to pull together a partnership of this size and to take everybody's feedback on board, not to mention the literally thousands of individual young people who contributed to the process. And we just wanted to take note that, maybe your agency is listed here. We find that some of the people who work in agencies who were associated with the process and agencies who have endorsed the guidelines, that they're not even aware that they're supposed to be using the guidelines or that their agency was part of the process. Next slide. So the key, we showed in the film, the key areas that the Compact works on are services. So trying to get age and gender responsive programming for protection, health, and development of young women, young men, girls, and boys within humanitarian settings. The Compact works on participation, so supporting the systematic conclusion and engagement of partnership with young people in all phases of humanitarian action. So the guidelines draw you through all the different phases of humanitarian action and how participation could look depending on your context. The Compact works to recognize and strengthen young people's capacities to be effective humanitarian actors. It works to increase the resources that are needed to address the needs of adolescents and youth. And interestingly, to find ways to track that spending to make sure that we're accountable on that end. And then finally, to ensure the generation and use of age and sex disaggregated data. I've been in this field for maybe like 15, 17 years, and we've been talking about the need for more age and sex disaggregated data, I think, from the day I got involved, and maybe we always will. Next slide, please. So coming out of priority 4, the guidelines themselves were a first attempt at trying to capture all the knowledge and best practices and case examples that we could find from around the world, and to get them in one place and to give people a place to start in working with young people, because I think it can be intimidating. The guidelines are similar to and inspired very much by the Child Protection Minimum Standards, the Gender-Based Violence Guidelines. So standing on the shoulders of the people who, many of you are here, who worked on those products and earlier on the SPHERE guidelines. So the guidelines take you through all the themes that might apply to your context, and really trying to stay specific to young people's priorities and needs in that process. Next slide. So just to run through it real quickly, the first section emphasizes making the case. So why do we need to be working with young people, and who's the target audience? And this section, I think, is especially useful for internal advocacy to help you and your agencies to convince your peers and colleagues why we need to be doing this and why it's important to make that case. And it's really well sourced, and we really tried very hard to give this to give the reader a place that you could not only work on internal advocacy with this information, but use it in your proposals to donors. Section B is about key principles, which I'll talk about in a moment. Section C is about meaningful participation. So this is strategic areas for ensuring that participation, ways that we can be using participation to influence laws and policies or build skills and capacities, working on addressing social norms, supporting different mechanisms and opportunities for participation in meaningful ways, assuming that young people want to participate at all, which they may not. Section D is about how young people can be involved and engaged across the humanitarian program cycle. So here we break the program cycle up, and we talk about different examples of, for example, like youth-led assessments during an emergency, or participatory action research. Young people can be involved in program evaluation, etc. And we have many, many real-world examples, so ways in which this has been made concrete. Section E is probably the biggest part of the guidelines, and this is about implementing adolescent and youth responsive programming across the different sectors. We also call these sector tip sheets. So, this is things like climate change adaptation, DRR, sustaining peace, health and nutrition and education, and all the sectors that we know. And we really went out and found, the newest, latest, hottest guidance we could find, and experts we could find. And a lot of this information had not been written down. And so we had to go and find, the person who works on emergency communication and happens to have a passion for working with young people, and pull that information out of their brains, because we couldn't necessarily find it written down. So if you're looking for a specific theme on youth and emergencies, it's probably in that section. And I don't think the intention was ever for someone to sit down and read this whole thing. It's actually quite a big book. But if you're working on a particular theme and you have young people in your context that are hoping or needing to be involved on that theme, you can go and probably try to find it. Next slide, please. So like I said, the guidelines start with a set of principles, and these were very much informed by the consultations that were held with adolescents and youth all over the world. The principles are about trying to change our narrative and engage young people as positive agents of change. So ensuring that we engage them meaningfully and safely, and obviously we want to avoid tokenism at all costs. Bring them to the table as partners. We want to leave aside our biases, and we want to ensure inclusivity across all the many, many diversities of humanity, be it, gender and sexual orientation and disability, and I mean, the many other diversities that we all are aware of. And obviously, we want to apply a do no harm approach at all times. I think my favorite of the principles that young people came up with together is this idea of giving away power. To Jason's point in the chat, and that to me, that means being willing as maybe older people working with and for young people to allow young people to take leadership, have agency, have ownership over the process if that's what they want to do, and they may not. It really requires us to make that individual decision as people in this field that this is not my program, that this belongs to the young people. So bringing it back to next slide, bringing it back to the Alliance annual meeting and the theme of child protection specifically, like Kate said, the guidelines acknowledged kind of a dual nature of young people in child protection. So on one hand, young people are, some of them, children themselves in need of protection, those adolescents below the age of 18. And on the other hand, young people are those who can be engaged, should be engaged as child protection actors themselves, if that's their decision. In every emergency, you have adolescents and youth who are caring for the protection needs of their younger siblings and other kids in the community, and they are doing that life-saving work without anyone asking them. And increasingly, you also have organized efforts to engage adolescents and youth in formal programming to reduce protection risk for their most vulnerable peers. And like I said, there are some pretty amazing examples in the guidelines of this kind of programming and all the different ways that it might look. So in a 2-page quick tip sheet on child protection, the guidelines give you ideas for how to better serve young people, get them involved in needs assessment, strategic planning, et cetera, the different phases of the humanitarian program cycle. Next slide. Young people can be involved even, in resource mobilization, like, do we have the right messaging for donors on adolescents and youth, or on implementation? Like I said, are we adequately reaching adolescents and youth and drawing on their capabilities in our program? Are we engaging young people to, just for an example, are young people involved in registering or managing or referring cases? Are there opportunities for them to volunteer in child protection roles? Can they take on paid roles? What are the, if we sit down and talk to each other in, like, for example, an NGO staff meeting about, what are the barriers to young people being involved? Why aren't they already here at the table? Like, what is it about us that is keeping that from happening? Are young people engaged in policy review or advocacy processes? And if they are we doing it safely? So there are some amazing examples of young people taking on national or regional or global advocacy roles and being able to influence humanitarian policy and practice in really meaningful, major ways. And we have examples of this that we've documented that are in the guidelines that I find really inspiring. Next slide. So what do we want to come out of this today? Like Kate said, we have this amazing resource in the guidelines, and I guess my main messages are, that there is this huge potential for meaningful engagement of young people in humanitarian efforts. It's really, like I said, kind of an individual decision. Are you going to care about this, prioritize it, and help to make it happen, facilitate it? Or do we just keep doing the things the way we have been? Obviously, it's important, again, to be advocating within your agencies for this need for sex and age disaggregated data, because it really starts there as a part of needs assessments or program implementation, or the various parts of the humanitarian program cycle. We really want to be addressing young people's needs and priorities in humanitarian response plans. So that's a really great entry point. We want to be obviously investing in developing skills and capacity of young people, as previously mentioned, and tracking that. What are we spending on this? And then finally, we want to be opening the book, right? Using the guidelines, see how they can apply to our area of work. You know, how can we connect with youth focal points and emergency focal points in our countries? Do we have a youth focal point or focal points in the context we're working? And if not, why not? Let's make it happen. And I guess I can leave it there. Thanks for the opportunity. I really, really proud of what we've been able to achieve with the guidelines. And like Hani says about the CPMS, it's just this amazing gift. You know, we've been able to put all of this information in one place and you know, use it as a stepping stone. And I can't wait for the next one to come out in 5 years or whatever. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Josh, and for walking us through the guidelines and kind of helping us to understand what they're about and where they came from. It's really a great privilege for us to have the person who kind of conceived of this and kind of birthed them to the first stage to be able to share that with us. So we really appreciate that. Now we'd actually like to break into smaller rooms. And this is going to be a chance for us to hear directly from in the breakout session 1 from Farida about her work as a youth leader, leading child protection work in the refugee context in the Chakatu refugee settlement in Uganda. And in room 2, to hear from Leo talk about YPIER's child protection work and disaster risk reduction and disaster response in the Philippines. So we're going to be divided a little bit randomly. We'll have a chance to hear from them about that work, and then also a brief opportunity for questions, and then a chance really to sort of discuss, well, how can the Alliance help us to do more in terms of youth participation and youth engagement? So I'll turn it over to Julie, who's going to zing us around and put us in the correct breakout session.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back.
We got cut off. Farida, I'm sorry, you got cut off in mid-sentence.
Oh, I'm sorry. Even with the 60 seconds.
Yes, but thank you for sharing your initial ideas.
Thank you, Kate. I think you can share my link, which I shared with you, through the chat box so that I can reply directly from our email. Thank you.
All right, we will. Thank you. We can follow up afterwards. We have almost done, so we want to wrap up. And I would just ask Julie to give us a hand, and maybe we can just share some of the sort of brainstorming, perhaps a word cloud that was generated, or some of the initial ideas that came up. And then we had suggestions from both group 1 and group 2. Okay, so here's our word cloud of a couple of words of what we can do to support in terms of the real value that young people bring to work in humanitarian action, specifically around child protection. And it really focuses youth need to be in the center, which I think says a lot. And using the experience of young people to underpin and drive child protection programming. Now, if we look at some of the specific takeaways in terms of what can the Alliance do to strengthen our work collectively with and for young people, there's some great ideas there. And maybe we can just look at, we didn't get a chance to rank them, but maybe we can just highlight what are some of the top line points that came up.
Sorry, Kate, to intrude here. I think participants can still, and Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, can still go on the group map and can give a thumbs up, like, or nothing to one of like the statements. So you're still able,
exactly,
like, to
anything
vote.
you like. If you see something you really like, just click on it. And then you can give it a thumbs up. You can add a comment right down here. So please feel free. If you see something that you particularly like the look of, give it a like. Let's not dislike. That's not nice.
So can we just, is that the link that Erica just posted in the chat there? The join.group map, so that we can actually do it in real time. Some of the top line ones that stood out to me were really the importance of providing technical support and expertise on how do we engage and facilitate participation of children and young people more effectively. And that's something that's certainly very actionable in the sense that we have these IASC guidelines and they are that resource. So how can we work perhaps between the Compact and the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action to help make that more real and to help make sure that we get these guidelines out to this group, sort of a captive audience of people who are working both at the policy level and the practice level to roll it out and to work in the field. And how can we do more in terms of giving up a little bit of power or perhaps a lot of power and actually facilitating and supporting young people's engagement and participation, including advocacy and including leading action. Okay, now I know we have about 2 more minutes. Let's just, if we can just share the last slide. We have a kind of a brief call to action, and I'd like to call on Farida. If you could read the first couple of points, and Leo, if you could read out the second couple of points. This call to action was drafted by young people when the IASC guidelines were launched back in February. And there's a lot of young people involved in humanitarian action who kind of contributed to this call to action. So Farida, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kate. We are calling on all humanitarian child protection actors to take the following initiatives and work together with young people. 1, include young people in all their diversity in humanitarian action, and you will receive not just input, but a creative way to achieve the goals. Working together, we can make a better world that supports the resilience and peaceful coexistence. 2, invest in building the capacity of young people. Strengthen our skills as effective humanitarian actors. Thank you.
3, involve young people in decision making. We have the right to participate in a meaningful way in key decision making processes. Trust our ability to make good decisions in our work and count on us to work with a partner with you. Lastly, support humanitarian actors to develop their capacity and skills to work effectively with and for young people. Recognize and support local youth-led initiatives and organizations in humanitarian response with coaching, mentoring, and funding. Support us, partner with us, and our collective efforts can make our goals and dreams possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo, and thank you, Farida. With that, we'll close our session. Huge thanks to everybody who participated in our session. Here are links to the IASC youth guidelines themselves. Please click, get your own copy. We have an amazing training package, which will be coming soon to this link. And go ahead and check out the Compact for Young People in Humanitarian Action. It's a great group and your organization may well already be involved. It's a great way to connect with others who are supporting and working with young people in humanitarian action. So huge thanks to everybody. A special thanks to Leo and Farida for sharing your expertise and your experience and your ideas about how we can support youth-led action.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Kate, and all of your team, Farida and Leo. Have a good continuation. You can now move on to one of the other sessions. You can decide to stick like in the accountability rooms, which will split according to thematic areas, or you can join another one of the priorities. It's completely up to you. But we'll just leave this room so that we can wrap it appropriately and move to the next one. I'll see you in the other rooms. And thanks again, everyone.
And I'm going to hand over, I think, to Layal to introduce the strategic priority. But before I do so, I'd just like to say a huge, huge thank you for you all for joining us today for this session. So we're going to be introducing to you strategic priority 1 on accountability, including meaningful participation of children. as part of our new strategy. We really want this to be an open space where you share, where you provide us recommendations, insights, and we have a bold strategy, and we really want you to challenge us moving forward. And we're really looking forward to listening to your presentations and your feedback. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hand over to Layal, who's going to introduce to the strategic priority 1 on accountability and its objectives. And then we will split into 2 groups. There will be one group led by Kath Williamson on accountability for children in armed conflict, and a second group led by Alana Keppel and her colleagues on supporting accountability to children through child-friendly feedback mechanisms. They will introduce their sessions in a small pitch, and then you will have the very difficult choice to choose where to go. And I will give you more instructions on that in a bit. So I'll hand over to Layal now, and we can move on to the next slide to introduce the strategic priority. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Elspeth. Julie, we can probably skip through this one pretty quickly, but when like the animations anyways. Basic ground rules, everyone. Participate if you can, please. The video on, I feel so on that. If you would like to turn your video on, please do. If you have the bandwidth for it, both actual internet bandwidth and just personal bandwidth, please do, especially when you get into small breakouts. It's just helpful to discuss with people, but respecting everyone's preferences there. We're going to try to stay on time. We're starting a little late, so I'm going to try to make up for that. And just please keep the conversations respectful, bearing in mind that everyone here is doing their best and here to participate and here to learn. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Julie. We did an overview of the new strategy this morning. If you weren't there, this is the overarching goal. We have 4 priorities. You are currently in the room discussing strategic priority 1 on accountability to children, which includes ensuring their meaningful participation. Next slide, please, Julie. Sorry, I'm going through these very quickly. Oh, this is the wrong batch. Okay. That was obviously a little mistake for another room. So for accountability to children, we have a goal in the new strategy. The goal is that humanitarian programs are accountable to children and ensure their meaningful and equitable participation. Simple to the point, complex to implement. Accountability to children includes a lot of different pieces. In the opening, we talked about there's the interagency standing committees, policy on accountability to affected populations, the importance of ensuring that when we think of affected populations, that children are there. And when we talk about their core tenets, which include, consultation and engagement with communities and ensuring that they can input into governance and leadership decisions, ensuring that they participate meaningfully, ensuring, I'm sort of blanking on the 5 commitments right now, but for us that, there's a rights-based approach to everything, that children are integrated within that, when we're talking about human rights, we're also talking about child rights. We're talking about the child's right to be heard, to be consulted, to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives. When we're talking about accountability and justice mechanisms, we often think of children as a group who are vulnerable, who need to be protected, and to some extent, and in some situations, that's true. But children are also an empowered group with capacities to contribute, to speak, and to share, and to also help influence and direct decision making. And so we really want to look at this issue from all sides and perspectives. Next slide, please, Julie. These are the objectives in the strategy. You'll have time to look through it when we release the strategy later. But again, top line, we're talking about accountability and participation in meaningful, intentional, and purposeful ways. We are looking a lot at child-friendly and child-led accountability procedures and increasing capacity within the sector to do that, but also working with our other sector colleagues on their ability to ensure that the feedback mechanisms and the accountability procedures across all sectors allow for children to be involved, to contribute, and to receive feedback. And then related to that is this idea of child-led and community-driven interventions, and we want to build towards that. There is some work already being done in these areas through the Alliance and its members, but really pushing the idea that these are areas that, it's not necessarily that an organization should come and sort of set up its mechanisms and procedures, but that these are things that can be community driven, that communities can push for and drive and design and lead, including children, the way that these interventions procedures are put in place and are implemented. Next slide, Julie. And I apologize, I know I'm going through this quite quickly. I just want to catch you up. Okay, so we're going to pause here for a second. As we said, there's 2 discussions happening in this room. So we're going to split up, one on accountability for children armed conflict and one on strengthening child-friendly feedback mechanisms. We're going to give a representative from those groups about a minute each just to quickly tell you what they're discussing in detail. And then you may all choose which conversation you want to join, and we'll split out from there. So I will start with, is it Kath or is it Alana? Sorry, I can't see the chat right now. But
I think it looks like the accountability for children is up for.
Right. Kath,
I will make it quick, and I apologize. I'm having some troubles with Zoom, so please, I'm so sorry if I do get kicked off. So for this session, and this is focused on accountability for children, specifically for children in conflict. I would just like to take you back 5 years to the opening of the First Alliance annual meeting. And during his inaugural speech, Nigel Fisher charged the Alliance with the responsibility to engage with the political on behalf of children if we are to move beyond what he called easily eradicated incremental change. And this requires us to think beyond our programmatic responses and consider what role we play in influencing the global architecture that enables or undermines the protection of children in humanitarian crises. And mechanisms that uphold accountability for children are a key part of this. Yet the role that many of our organisations play as operational agencies sometimes complicates our ability to engage. So today we'll hear findings from 2 reports that were published this year that focus on strengthening accountability for children in conflict in complementary ways. Keeping the Promise by the Eminent Persons Group reviews the listing and delisting of perpetrators of grave violations against children in conflict by the UN Secretary General between 2010 and 2020. And we're joined by Adrienne Lepar from Watchlist for Children in Armed Conflict, Shelley Whitman from the Dallaire Institute to present on that. And then Advancing Justice for Children was written by Save the Children and the University of Oxford. And that identifies barriers to the investigation, documentation, and indictment of violations and crimes affecting children in conflict in judicial and non-judicial accountability mechanisms and strategies to overcome these barriers. Then we'll have time to discuss the findings and in breakout groups, identify examples of good practice and innovative ideas about how the Alliance, what role the Alliance can play. We would really love to have you join us and contribute to that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kath. I know, just Julie, the slides are for the one we split. Next, Alana, if you could tell us a little bit what's happening in the feedback mechanisms group, and then everyone will split up.
Perfect. I'll keep it short and sweet. So in our group, we'll be looking at child-friendly reporting and feedback mechanisms. You'll hear an overview of child rights and child participation in humanitarian work and action. And then we'll share some really quick and brief case studies from 3 of our programs, sort of unpacking some of the common challenges and solutions that we've found within reporting and feedback mechanisms for children. We'll take a quick visit through child protection coordination mechanisms and their role in accountability. And then there will be opportunities for questions and sharing and reflection on some of the ideas that were shared. So look forward to seeing some of you there.
Okay. Kath, over to you as our initial speaker on the children affected by armed conflict conversation. And I also would just like to highlight to the guests, Kath will be handing over. We have Shelley Whitman, who's the director of the Dallaire Institute, and Adrienne Lepar, who is the, and I'm sorry if I just mispronounced that, Adrienne, I think I did, director of Watchlist, who will also be presenting in this segment. So Kath, over to you.
Great, thanks, Lael. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the session on accountability for children affected by armed conflict. Thank you for coming. My name is Catherine Williamson. I'm a senior humanitarian child protection advisor with Save the Children based in London. And the objective of this session is to share recent research on accountability for violations against children in conflict and consider what role the Alliance can play in contributing towards strengthening accountability and preventing further violations against children. And as I mentioned in the pitch, we'll present findings of 2 research reports, Keeping the Promise on the listing and delisting of perpetrators of grave violation, and then advancing justice for children on the investigation, documentation, and indictment of violations and crimes affecting children. So the two reports are complementary, with the first focusing on the central mechanism that's used to address grave violations of child rights in conflict, and the second broadening the scope of accountability to consider how we can strengthen other judicial and non-judicial accountability mechanisms. And throughout the presentations, we need to keep in mind what role we can play as agencies working to protect children in humanitarian crises, and what sort of action we can take within the Alliance. And we'll have time to discuss the findings in plenary, and then we'll go into breakout groups to discuss the potential contribution of the Alliance in this area. And I hope that through that we can start to identify existing good practice and innovative ideas that we can then bring back to the plenary. So if we move to the next slide. So why are we focusing on this issue? And Lael framed the discussion on accountability in relation to the Alliance strategy for 2021 to 25. So obviously the strategy aims to put children and their protection at the centre of humanitarian action. And the introduction to the strategy notes that in the context of armed conflict, attacks on children are increasing as accountability decreases. So the strategy is structured around 4 strategic priorities. And these are accountability, both to children and for children, including by advocating for greater prevention of and accountability for violations of children's rights. Localization, and I should note that today we're focusing on global accountability mechanisms, but clearly when working with children, we should always prioritize local and national accountability that is safe and meaningful for children and families, and that reinforces rule of law. And it's when these break down or they can't or won't be used that global accountability has a key role to play. The third pillar is multi-sector and integrated programming, and the fourth pillar is prevention. And that includes a focus on supporting critical elements of justice and accountability for children, particularly around preventing grave violations. So I'll now hand over to Adrienne and Shelley to present the findings and recommendations of Keeping the Promise by the Eminent Persons Group. If we move to the next slide.
Great. Thanks, Kath, and many thanks to the organizers for inviting us to present about this report. I'm Adrienne Lepar. I'm the director of Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict, which represents a network of human rights and humanitarian organizations working to end grave violations against children in armed conflict. So as all of you know, the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict includes an annex list of perpetrators of grave violations. And this list provides a key first step towards accountability by clearly identifying perpetrators responsible for grave violations. The mechanism also serves as a foundation for the UN's engagement with listed parties to develop and sign action plans and to create tangible change for children on the ground. But in recent years, the process for determining which perpetrators are included on the list has become increasingly politicized, and its credibility has been damaged. And over the years, Watchlist has strongly supported the monitoring and reporting mechanism and advocated for a credible list that's based in the evidence collected by the MRM. We've engaged through bilateral advocacy, joint open letters to the SG, and even publishing our own annual shadow list report where we give recommendations for listings ahead of the publication of the annual report. But in 2020, following the egregious delisting of the Tatmadaw for recruitment and use of children and the Saudi-led coalition for killing and maiming children in Yemen, despite hundreds of violations documented by the UN in each of those conflicts, Watchlist and the members of its advisory board developed a unique plan to convene a group of experts to examine the last 10 years of the SG's annual reports and assess the use of objective and consistent criteria across all perpetrators. And that group consisted of several prominent experts in our field, including Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, Yankee Lee, Benyam Dawit Mesmoor, and Alan Rock. And the Eminent Persons Group launched its report in March of this year ahead of the publication of the SG's report, which came later in June. Using the UN's own data as the evidence base, the EPG's report found that, in fact, the process for listing perpetrators of grave violations had become increasingly politicized in recent years, with influential member states successfully evading listing, lobbying to be dropped from the list, or lobbying on behalf of their friends. So to highlight a few of the key findings from that analysis of the data in the reports, the findings found that at least 8 parties to conflict, including 6 government forces, had been found responsible for killing and maiming more than 100 children in a 1-year period, yet they evaded listing. During that 10-year period as well, 3 parties to conflict were prematurely removed from the list, even though they hadn't met the existing criteria for delisting, which state that a party should sign an action plan and complete the action plan to end and prevent violations, and go a full reporting period without registering any new violations. The EPG called on the SG to hold all perpetrators of grave violations of children's rights to the same standard, in line with Security Council resolutions on CAC. And the experts conducted outreach to the SG, to the SRSG CAC, member states, and other stakeholders to disseminate their message and these findings. The report garnered attention and praise from member states and stakeholders also within the UN system. And to report back following the publication of the SG's report in June, although inconsistencies still exist, including notably the exclusion of Israeli forces and the Saudi-led coalition from the SG's list, there were some notable positive changes in the 2021 annual report, namely the inclusion of the Somali National Army for sexual violence against children and the Afghan National Army for killing and maiming children, as well as the relisting of the Tatmadaw for recruitment and use. A solid number of member states also have continued to express their support for the listing mechanism as a solid tool for accountability, including through public statements at the Security Council open debate on CAC. I'll now hand over to Dr. Shelley Whitman, the Executive Director of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security, who is also engaged in this initiative and will connect to the Institute's work on accountability and prevention.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you, Layal and Kath as well, and everyone here. The introduction to the report, very ably done by Adrian. I supported this work through working with General Dallaire and the various drafts of this report. And I felt that at this particular forum, what would be great is to look at the Keeping the Promises report in terms of one of the key areas that is also a challenge for accountability and really focusing on prevention, is the need for this reliable and credible data collection to remove it from merely reporting on violations to being able to predict and then act to prevent violations. So from the perspective of the Dallaire Institute, some of you may have heard about our work on a project that we created a few years ago that is now coming into real movement in terms of what we've been able to create and collaborate on, called Knowledge for Prevention. And the aim of that particular project is to work on prevention mechanisms in target conflict environments that are better informed to protect children from recruitment and use. So as an example, if we think about the work that we were doing on the Keeping the Promises report and the data that we were able to look at, if we can understand that the MRM system is not a preventative system, it's a system of reporting on violations after they have occurred and 1 year later issuing a report. We also know that in terms of our data collection and comparing it to the MRM system, that on any of the given situations that are reported on, it is 7 to 15 times more out of touch, out of sync with the probability and likelihood of violations of children in those situations of concern. So we are really doing a serious underreporting of the level of violations that occur. What we have noticed very much from our work on creating this predictive model is that early warning systems around the globe, and this is based on research with specialists in the area of early warning, we have found so far that there are no early warning systems of conflict prevention that look at children or look at recruitment and use even further down in terms of an area of specialization. So we've got to find a way to encourage child-centered indicators that see children as essential to conflict prevention, develop that data, and understand its connection to further inform prevention efforts. This also means that we have to understand that, the ability to predict will also help us with prevention efforts. And at the same time, what we would really like to see is that when we are flagging that there are issues of accountability, it is also because we don't have enough data to inform credible actions. And so in the work that we are doing, and what I'd love to be able to engage with everyone on, is how we take the early warning to move it to early response, so that when we say prevention, we're actually talking about and identifying collectively intervention strategies and resourcing early responses appropriately. Very last point I would raise is that for us, the great example of this has been in Mozambique in the Cabo Delgado region, where over the past year and a half, we have been flagging likelihood of recruitment and use based on our K4P predictive model. We tried at the UN system to flag this for the SRSG's report that was issued. Unfortunately, it didn't make it into this year's SRSG's report because we were told there wasn't enough data coming directly from UN authorities on the ground. The good news is that we worked with policymakers in SADC and from other member states to flag this at that level. And it has now led to programming collaboration with UNICEF on the ground to address it from the perspective of the work that we do to train and work with forces on the ground to improve their interactions with children in armed conflict situations, in a hope that maybe we can at least further prevent atrocities. So I wanted to just flag the connection between that project and the Keeping the Promise project. And what we hope is that the combination of the two things will help us to get to a new mandate once we get through this assessment of the 25 years. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Shelley and Adrian. That's so exciting. And honestly, I think that the Knowledge for Prevention project just sounds so innovative and like it really could be quite a game changer in many ways. So I'm very excited to hear about that. If we move to the next slide, I'll just present on advancing justice for children. This is the result of research undertaken by Save the Children and the University of Oxford as part of Save the Children's commitment to protect children in conflict. And the aim was to identify strategies and solutions to overcome barriers to the investigation, documentation, and indictment of violations and crimes affecting children in conflict. And it focuses on the work of UN fact-finding and investigative bodies and international criminal courts and tribunals, collectively referred to as accountability mechanisms. And the research identified multiple barriers to accountability for children. And these are attitudinal, financial and structural, and in many cases they're mutually reinforcing. Firstly, accountability mechanisms are adult-centric, and attitudinal barriers tend to lead to the invisibilization of children within accountability mechanisms. They're seen as incidental victims, and the specific impact of violence on their life trajectories isn't recognized. So there's a lack of age and gender disaggregated analysis of violations, which means that the opportunities to understand both the intention of perpetrators in targeting children and the long-term impact of that targeting is missed. And that analysis is critical to effective accountability. Secondly, international prosecutors enjoy varying degrees of discretion in choosing whether or not to initiate investigations. And even if there is evidence of a violation, whether to prosecute and on what charges. And there are various dynamics at play here. One example is that for war crimes, it's usually more straightforward to prove violations of the treatment of civilians and those who are hors de combat, rather than violations of the conduct of war, which are those which often disproportionately affect children. Thirdly, child competent approaches are rarely mainstreamed in investigation, documentation, and prosecution strategies. Investigating violations and crimes affecting children is generally conflated with interviewing children, and many investigators don't consider that to be appropriate. Other means of collecting evidence of violations through secondary data and adult witnesses are then overlooked. Fourthly, and related to this, accountability mechanisms tend to lack the child competent expertise that may unlock that third issue. So ad hoc investigation mechanisms such as fact-finding missions and independent investigations are usually quite urgent. They have short timeframes, uncertain resources, and that makes it difficult to engage the right level of expertise on what are considered non-mainstream issues. Often they rely on staff seconded from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and they rarely have a child rights focus. It's rare for them to have a dedicated focal point on children. Without that, there's the risk that the information collection plans won't adequately cover violations against children, or that the information gathered won't be analysed from a child rights perspective. And finally, non-judicial accountability mechanisms don't always have the resources or infrastructure to effectively protect and support individuals who provide information, including children and their families. And by contrast, international criminal courts and tribunals are equipped with witness protection and psychosocial support structures. But even so, the effective protection and support of individuals providing information and evidence remains challenging in practice. And that obviously affects the willingness of families to engage. And the report makes a series of recommendations. Chief amongst these are the need to build political backing to prioritise and resource the investigation and documentation of violations. The need for accountability mechanisms to adopt specific policies and strategies to focus on violations and crimes against children. The need to build expertise in the investigation and documentation of these crimes and ensure mechanisms for rapid deployment, particularly within the OHCHR. And ensure that victims and their families remain central to the process and that there's more sustained outreach, witness protection and psychosocial support for them. If we move to the next slide, this is just to highlight that in relation to the first recommendation to build political backing for holding perpetrators of violations to account. The report makes an interesting comparison with the evolution of accountability for gender-based violence crimes. And if we look at gender-based violence crimes, the legal principles related to the prosecution were hard fought and established during the international criminal tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia. And since 2012, the Justice Rapid Response and UN Women have deployed experts and sometimes multiple experts to every commission of inquiry and most fact-finding missions. And the momentum gained has provided engines of advocacy at the highest political and diplomatic levels to ensure that gender-based violence crimes are investigated and prosecuted. And while a lot remains to be done in this area, it's now quite deeply ingrained in accountability mechanisms that gender-based violence crimes, prosecution is essential. And the quote here from Faisal Abdul Ghani, the Executive Director of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, is quite illustrative of this, where he notes how much more focus and how many more organisations were focused on gathering evidence of gender-based violence crimes than they were of reporting on children. And one specific barrier that was identified was a lack of a comprehensive focus on accountability across states, UN leadership and civil society organisations. And that was identified as a key difference between accountability for gender-based violence and accountability for violations against children. So key states have funded and driven a focus on accountability for gender-based violence. But that degree of focused political will doesn't seem to be there to the same extent for violations against children. And in relation to UN leadership, the mandate of the SRSG for Children in Armed Conflict is specific to the monitoring and reporting of grave violations. And UNICEF do an incredible job of supporting the documentation of grave violations and engaging with parties to conflict to end and prevent violations. But humanitarian principles can prevent UNICEF and many international NGOs from engaging in criminal accountability efforts. And that's one of the complicating factors. And the quote from Rosalind Sipos about in this slide is illustrative of that. And feels very familiar to me as a practitioner. And it's a very understandable dynamic. And I just highlight that as something we need to be aware of in our discussions. And because of this, that sort of accountability constituency for child rights is not there to the same extent. I think we will need to, that's the end of the presentations on the 2 reports. I think we have gone over time. I haven't been watching time, I'm afraid. I apologize for that. But we, yeah, I think we will have a quick plenary discussion if there are any key questions from anyone, and then we'll move into breakout rooms.
All right, yeah, we'll get there.
I'm concerned some people don't know how to leave the room.
That's okay. I think whereas we may not have had time to recap, I feel like these discussions, the 2 individual breakouts, did bring up a lot of really important questions that need further discussion and need further follow-up. So I'm going to sound like a broken record, but if you are interested in carrying on conversations around some of the things we've been discussing today that are all linked specifically to the Alliance's new strategy and how it will then be implemented, there's a Google form floating around everywhere. Please throw your name on, check which ones you're interested in, and later there will be outreach for whatever you flagged your interest in. But it was really, I just want to say thank you to Kath for helping put this, this was, she knows this is my pet area and I could not organize a single thing on it. And so I threw out an email being like, if I could make us a space to talk about children in armed conflict, can you do it all? And she just said yes and ran with it. And thank you, Adrienne and Shelley, for coming in so last minute, and for all of you for joining. I know people who joined this topic in particular, it's highly technical, but we're all very passionate about it. And I think the new strategy provides so many opportunities for the Alliance to work on children in armed conflict. And I know many of us are very happy about that. So looking forward to carrying forward some of these actions and conversations. And right now, I need to get out of here because I'm facilitating the plenary wrap up, and all of you please come with us.